Good evening, everybody. Tonight we have Dr. Vance Holliday back, and title of the talk tonight is Clovis Archaeology Across the Greater Southwest. Dr. Vance Holliday received a bachelor's in anthropology from the University of Texas and a master's in museum science at Texas Tech University and a PhD in geological sciences at UC Boulder, Colorado. He is on the geography faculty at the University of Wisconsin and is now in both anthropology and geosciences at the University of Arizona. His research career began on the Great Plains of the US, focused on reconstructing and interpreting the landscapes and environments in which the earliest occupants of North America lived and how those conditions evolved during the Paleoindian period. Since arriving at the University of Arizona, he became director of the Archaeological Research Fund, which is devoted to research on the archaeology and geoarchaeology of the Paleoindian period in the southwestern US and in northwestern Mexico. In addition, he has been part of an international project focused on the upper Paleolithic archaeology and paleo-environments of southwestern Russia and central Ukraine. Again, the title of his talk tonight is Clovis Archaeology Across the Greater Southwest. I give you Dr. Vance Holliday.
Thank you very much. Glad to be back. Return engagement. I recognize some names and faces from last time. It's good to see everybody. Not to play favorites, but it's particularly nice to have a soil scientist along and a zooarchaeologist. Those two fields are near and dear to me. The disciplines are near and dear to me. So it's glad to have you all here. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into the slides. Bring this up, my PowerPoint presentation here. Last time I spoke, I talked about the discoveries, remarkable discoveries in White Sands National Park. And that's that particular period in archaeology. This was like over 20,000 years ago, sometimes referred to as pre-Clovis. And so I thought what I would do with this talk is talk about Clovis. Just as a refresher for you, this is sort of the classical, almost stereotypical Paleoindian archaeological sequence. Essentially, this is the Great Plains sequence, which is probably one of the best known, probably the most intensely studied, with Clovis representing the earliest occupation. And Clovis, in fact, being continent-wide, it's really the only archaeological assemblage we know of in North America that was continent-wide, or that we see continent-wide. We presume that people are connected. And then you have a series of essentially artifact styles representing the periods here, Clovis artifacts that we'll talk some more about. And then Clovis evolves, as far as we could tell, evolves into Folsom, a little bit younger, so 13,000 or so to 12,000. Beautiful, exceptionally well-made artifacts. And then late Paleoindian bison hunters. Folsom were bison hunters, the late Paleoindian bison hunters. And you see more variability in the artifact styles in the late Paleoindian times. And a hallmark of these artifacts is high quality workmanship and usually very high quality raw materials if they can get a hold of it. So the artifact assemblages have always been of interest. In part, just aesthetically, they're gorgeous, some of them, and also the technical skill in making these artifacts has been noteworthy. So there's been quite a bit of interest in this. And then in the West, particularly the Great Basin, there was another artifact assemblage called Western Stemmed. It's distinctive, but you don't see the as distinct subdivisions through time, and it spans a lot of time. In fact, some of it's probably pre-Clovis. Anyway, we're going to talk about Clovis tonight. I've devoted a fair amount my time to working on Clovis and other Paleoindian archaeology, but here in the Southwest, several Clovis sites, and I'll talk about some of the sites I've been working on, and I'll also talk about some other localities that are well known that you all would be interested in knowing about. So, two things I'm going to come back to, and I'm going to talk about a little bit as we go through this. Do we see any patterning to Clovis landscape use, and were Clovis foragers big game hunters? This is a term that's been around for a long time. I remember in my undergrad intro North American archaeology class, the book we used, the title on Paleoindian archaeology was Big Game Hunters. And there's quite a bit of debate about the degree to which Paleoindians hunted big game, and a lot of people think that this particular illustration represents more of the reality than successful hunts, but that remains to be seen. So what we'll do, just a little travel log essentially across the southwestern US. The first thing I'm going to do is mention the Folsom Site, and we're not going to talk about Folsom archaeology, but the Folsom Site and the Clovis Site are historically important, and I'll explain that in a second, in Paleoindian archaeology. And then we'll, and then from after the discussion of the Clovis Site, we'll launch into discussion of a few other sites. As I say, some of them I've worked on and or I'm familiar with, and we'll end up in northwestern Sonora, Mexico. So the reason I'm mentioning the Folsom Site, and some of you are already aware of this, the Folsom discoveries in the late 1920s dramatically changed North American archaeology, because that is where clear proof was discovered demonstrating a human presence in the Americas coincident with so-called Ice Age animals, extinct megafauna. And in the upper right, I hope you can see my arrow. This is a well-known photo, a very famous discovery. This was the first Folsom point found. It's broken, but it's very obviously an artifact, so there's no doubt of that. Found in context with the ribs of a large bison, an extinct form of bison, probably half again the size of the North American buffalo that you would be familiar with. And it had been a huge debate about how long people had been in the Americas, very acrimonious at times. And it was solved in the summer of 1927 at the Folsom Site, where the photo is. That's part of the excavation. There's an arroyo off to the right. And some of you know the story of George McJunkin. He was a former slave and spent his latter decades as a rancher or a cowboy near Folsom, New Mexico. And he was one of these classic sort of self-made people. And he was obviously very smart, and he had quite an interest in paleontology, and kept seeing bones eroding out of this arroyo. And unfortunately, he never lived to see this discovery. He died in 1922. But his friends, including this fellow here, drawing a blank on his first name, Schwackheim, he was a local blacksmith. He and some friends came out to have a look at these bones, and they got the Denver Museum involved, and lo and behold, they made this discovery. So that dramatically changed people's thinking about the peopling of the Americas. So then a few years later, at the Clovis Site, also known as the Blackwater Draw Site, in this gravel pit, some scientists from American Museum, paleontologists, archaeologists, started working, because people were finding the remains of extinct animals and beautiful artifacts. And that began a project, it's been going for 90 years now. I should mention, by coincidence, this evening, just about 2 hours ago, there was another Zoom lecture I heard about by the site manager out at the Clovis Site, giving a talk on the Clovis Site. So somewhere, I think that's going to be posted on YouTube. I'm going to try to track it down. Anyway, so a lot of work at the Clovis Site beginning in the 30s. And you can see large bone here, some mammoth remains, and I think some bison over here in this left-hand corner, and folks excavating and picnicking, it looks like, at the site in the 1930s. A lot of the site was destroyed through quarrying for gravel, particularly in the 1960s. In this old photograph, I've indicated where the archaeological strata are. There are lake beds. You see the white layer right there, and they're mostly gone. You can go there today. It's well worth a visit, but most of the site is gone. A lot of the artifacts are on display. Lots of discoveries came out of the Clovis type site. These are the type artifacts. There's not a scale here. Well, it says natural size. That doesn't do us any good. This one here on the left is about 6 inches long. So you can see very well made, has the distinctive flute or channel here in the base of this one. And then there was another artifact nearby and some other tools. Now that was in 36. And then the photo you see here was in 1962 when the quarrying really took off, and big scrapers ran into some bone, and it was a mammoth kill. There were remains of 5 mammoths. I circled 3 of the bone piles here. There were 2 more. There's one over here, and then there's one out of view, and associated with springs. Mammoth with Clovis artifacts. And this was a pattern that was starting to appear. There were a few other sites that had these distinctive artifacts with mammoth, but people kept referring to them as Folsom-like or Folsomoid for some years, thinking they were all similar. And they were right, but that was about all they could figure out, except with additional work at the site. You see lake beds here. They're working on Clovis material down at the bottom, but there's lake beds up above. And those lake beds produced Folsom, what we now call what were called Folsom artifacts at the time. And people finally began to realize there's a difference. Clovis artifacts look different, and they're stratigraphically below, older than Folsom, and Clovis artifacts are consistently associated with mammoth. Folsom artifacts are younger and consistently associated with the big bison. And so that's one of the key components of the early work at the Clovis site, is demonstrating that relative age relationship, and then giving the name Clovis to this artifact style. So the Folsom style was named for the Folsom site, and then eventually, when they worked this stratigraphic relationship out at the Clovis site, Clovis was applied. Now, I should also mention that, as you saw on the slide, this site is also known as the Blackwater Jaw site. I prefer Clovis for a variety of reasons, but this is also known as Blackwater Jaw. So there are all sorts of archaeological features at the site. It was a large lake basin, and there are multiple Clovis occupations, kills, camps. There are multiple Folsom kills, camps, and there are multiple late Paleoindian kills and camps, or were. They're mostly gone now. But it was quite a remarkable site. There's really no one's ever found anything like it, given just the sheer size and number of features. I've worked a lot at the Love Oak Lake site in Texas, and it probably has a similar record, but fortunately, most of that site's intact. It wasn't ripped out. Now, what we'll do, we'll move into central New Mexico, and we'll start on the Jornada del Muerto Basin, which is a little bit north of White Sands. The White Sands locality I told you about was associated with this paleo lake. On this map here, blue represent ancient lakes that existed in the late Pleistocene, scattered across New Mexico and Arizona. And the long skinny lake is where the tracks are. And then to the north, in the next basin north, in the Jornada del Muerto, we've done some work. There's a lot of archaeology scattered out through this area in both basins, a lot of Paleoindian archaeology. And that's what took me to that area, was to better understand how people were using the landscape out there. So the Mockingbird Gap site, here we are in the Jornada del Muerto Basin. It's along this drainage, Chupadera Draw. And it's not clear what that draw was doing during Clovis time, say 13,000 years ago, because you can't trace it anymore. I think it was draining into this Paleo Lake Trinity. The Trinity site, the bomb site, original A-bomb site when that was tested in 1945, was about halfway between the Mockingbird Gap site and the Paleo Lake on this map. It would be out here somewhere on the White Sands Missile Range. In any case, Mockingbird Gap has a huge Clovis assemblage, and then there are a lot of Folsom sites scattered around as well. I've indicated a few of the Folsom sites, and there are even fewer Clovis sites, but Mockingbird Gap's quite a assemblage. Now, this grassy area right here is the draw, it's Chupadero draw. It really doesn't look like very much. There's a ridge on the east side, and I'm standing on a ridge. And the archaeological site is on the uplands. It was a surface site. And we did a lot of coring with this coring rig across the draw to see what the history of the draw is and how it might have related to the occupation. So these are a few of the artifacts. Huge assemblage. It was put together by a geologist who worked for the New Mexico Bureau of Geology for many, many years. And he was also interested in archaeology, and he collected out there, but he was very meticulous with his collecting. He recorded everything and mapped it in for over decades. And this is long before the days of GPS. And this is just one part of the site, very extensive surface site. There are something like 200 Clovis points and Clovis preforms off of this site, and just all sorts of other occupation debris. It covers close to a square mile. It's a very large site. And that's why we were interested in it. So in my diagram here, the camp is over here on the uplands. There's a ridge, and then this is the surface of Chupadero Draw. But in our coring, we discovered that the draw, this is scale, that's 10 meters. The Clovis surface, the surface when the site on the uplands was occupied, that surface was almost 30 feet deeper in the draw. So there was like a miniature canyon here in this draw. And we ran in with our coring, we ran into evidence for wetlands, paleo wetlands in this draw. And that was probably the attraction. In fact, probably a mix of wetlands and flowing water during Clovis times. And we think that's the attraction. And it's the single biggest Clovis site anywhere in that area, anywhere in southern New Mexico, and for that matter, even in Arizona. Just the extent of the thing is really quite remarkable. So a very large Clovis assemblage here. We don't know if it was maybe a few people living in one place for many years, or a lot of people for a short amount of time. No way to sort that out from a surface assemblage. But we have the surface assemblage, state of New Mexico does, and it's well provenienced, and so we can do a lot with that collection, fortunately. Now, just as an aside, in these cores, the last core I did, I wanted to reproduce this one, 07-9, and we went out in 08, got a core, had it, put it in plastic. I wanted to save it to collect for paleoenvironmental studies. I was in my office. I was going to get rid of the sand, and I had a spoon, and I scooped up some sand, and this was in the spoon. I thought it was a piece of bone at first, and then I realized it was rounded on the ends, and it had a hole through it. And we looked under in a microscope, and there are grooves. This is a bead. We thought it was Clovis age. I made the mistake. This is an important lesson. I went and got some more dates on my core, and I shouldn't have done that, because those new dates suggest that this bead, where we found it in this core, might be Folsom age. Doesn't matter. It's still cool. It was down at 9.5 meters in this core. I've never found anything like that in a core. Anyway, a Clovis or a Folsom bead, very rare. Now we'll come closer to home for me, in the San Pedro Valley, which it heads in northern Sonora. Mexico, and flows into the Gila River. And it's quite the hotbed of Clovis archaeology. Now, one thing I'll say, while I'm thinking of it here, the Clovis site is way over here. There's lots of Paleoindian sites. Once you go down into the Pecos Valley, there are very few Clovis sites. Mockingbird Gap here and a few others, and none buried that I know of until you get into the San Pedro Valley. There's Folsom all over the place, up and down the Rio Grande Valley, all the way up into Colorado. There's smatterings of Clovis here and there. It's a very different distribution of sites. Mockingbird, a couple of others, and then buried sites here, but Folsom all over the place in the valley. But you run out of Folsom before you get to the Arizona state line. Folsom seems to be more of a Great Plains thing, probably focused on hunting bison. Okay, San Pedro Valley, here's the international border. There are at least 4 and possibly 6 Clovis mammoth kills from about between Sierra Vista and Naco. It's probably the highest concentration of mammoth kills in the world in terms of space and time. They're all Clovis age, so they occupy a fairly narrow bit of time, and they're over. Man, I don't have a scale on this map. This is about 50 miles, I guess. So we'll look at a couple of these. They're the 4 confirmed, or the Naco site, the Laner site, Escapol, and Murray Springs. We'll look at the Naco and Murray Springs. Tombstone's up here, if you know where that is. And Bisbee would be down here somewhere. So Naco, 1952. This is the first Clovis mammoth kill discovered off of the Great Plains. It was 1 mammoth with 9 Clovis points. I don't see them here. If you're ever in Tucson, come to the Arizona State Museum. This block with these ribs is on display here in town at the museum, and you can see plastic casts of the points that were in place in this pile of ribs. So it was in the near the bottom of this arroyo and some old stream channel deposits. It was excavated in 4 days. This was 1952, but it was excavated, considering it was excavated quite well. And put Naco in southeastern Arizona on the Clovis archaeological map. Now we'll jump ahead. The most recent excavations and the most recently discovered Clovis site, this was in the 60s and 70s, is Murray Springs, which is, let's go back. So we're jumped up here to Murray Springs. It's on a draw that flows into the San Pedro River. So this is a cross section, and I'm not going to go into any details. You can see a photograph here. The critical zone is this black, so-called black mat, and that's this black zone here, QCL. It's geologic mapping terminology, and it's essentially Folsom age, and there's no Folsom artifacts, but it covered the Clovis occupation. And the Clovis occupation was right on top of these gravels, or on top of gravels and sand, and then buried by the black mat. And then over here on some old lake beds, there was a camp with Clovis artifacts. So camp up here, and then kills, several kills down here in the paleo draw. Oops, I'm sorry. I intended to put that phone away, excuse me. So now we're looking down on the site. The tan, the darker tan, QT, that's the sediment that buries the Clovis material. Okay, and then the other colors are older deposits. So this arroyo right here, cutting through that sediment, exposed several different Clovis features right in here. So there was a Clovis bison kill here, Clovis mammoth kill here, and then the camp is up on the old uplands right here. And those are the excavation areas. There was also an old spring, a paleo spring, which was probably one of the attractions as well, and why Clovis people were living on this upland area and then hunting and killing animals down in the bottom of the draw, the paleo draw. It filled up, and then arroyo cutting exposed the archaeology and geology. So this is the excavations in the Mammoth area. There's the black mat. They peeled that off, and you can see the dark staining. These depressions here might be mammoth tracks. In this photograph, the mammoth bone is gone. They're excavating the mammoth, one mammoth. You can see the teeth here, tusks. Oh, there we go. It's a better photograph. Oh, it's the same. Yeah, they're excavating the teeth here. So there was one mammoth kill with one individual. There was a bison kill with 14 bison and a camp, all Clovis. So rare Clovis bison kill. These are artifacts from the bison kill and from the camp up here. And a remarkable thing, I remember when I first heard about this when I was a student, and I remember there was a gasp in the audience when it was my predecessor, who now my predecessor and friend here, another Vance Haynes, excavated this and talked to us about it. One of the points, this one, I think, in the kill, the broken tip was in the camp. And then this broken point here was in the camp, and its matching tip broken off was in the kill. You know, that just doesn't happen. And here they had two refits, clearly linking the camp and the bison kill. The same people were probably that killed the mammoth were probably in the camp as well, but this was clear evidence, and this is really that's a very rare discovery. Really a remarkable Clovis story along the Upper San Pedro in southeastern Arizona. Now, when I visited there on several different occasions on field trips, every time I was on a trip there, one of the questions that always came up in the group was what's going on south of the border, because Naco is a couple hundred meters from the Mexican border, and you can see the border from the Murray Springs site. And after I got here, I started working with a student, a Mexican archaeologist who was one of our grad students, and she had quite an interest in Clovis archaeology, and she was trying to find more Clovis material in northern Mexico. She already knew of some sites. Anyway, long story short, we discovered the site, El Fin del Mundo. It got its name because it's so remote. When the crew first went out there, the landowner told the archaeological survey crew we had, the landowner said, "Hey, you ought to come to my ranch. I've got some big bones eroding out." And so they went out there, and when they got to the site, somebody in the truck said in Spanish, we're at the end of the world, El Fin del Mundo. And when it turned out to be an archaeological site, the name stuck. So it's a very remote area. This is not snow, it's caliche, calcium carbonate, probably from spring deposits on the surface. And so there was a little erosional island down here that exposed a buried Clovis kill. And then all around it on older uplands is a Clovis camp. So similar in some ways to Murray Springs, with kill down in a paleo arroyo and then an extensive camp on the uplands. So this is a real simple cross section. Most of the site is gone, the intact part of the site. There's a little island of sediment. It's the island with the feature is smaller, the footprint smaller than most people's houses. It's quite small. And buried under lake beds is a bone bed. Diatomite, those are lake beds in bone here. And then there's an even older bone bed that's not archaeological, it's paleontological. And this occurs in one place. and most of it was gone. There's a very extensive arroyo system that took out most of the site some point in time in the past, because everywhere else you go around there, there's an old upland, old stable upland. It's got a big red soil that suggests it's been setting there for thousands of years, and that's exactly right, because all the Clovis Camp, the Clovis artifacts are on the surface. This is the big red soil, and lots and lots of Clovis artifacts. There's lots of inscrapers, blades, and broken Clovis points scattered across the camp. And then down here in the island, that's the island. There's a little bit of it left here, but you can see it's quite small. Arroyo cutting completely surrounds it now, leaving just this remnant. And the gray there, those are lake beds. And we peeled this off, took all of that off to the right, and then quite a bit of this going back to expose a Clovis Kill. I'm standing on the old red soil that has the camp when I took this photograph. That's all, right here is all that's left that's intact. Here's a cross section, again, just showing the sequence. And so the Clovis feature is buried in the top of some spring derived alluvium stream deposits, about 13,000 years old, and then buried by these pond sediments, pond and marsh sediments. So they're excavating the main part of the kill. There was some bones here and bones here, 2 bone piles, most of it gone by erosion. You can see there's the old arroyo here, and then right there was the arroyo. So there's not very much left. This is one of the bone piles, this bone pile here, and then the other one is already taken out in this photo. And there were Clovis points in association. This is a broken one and a very small reworked point. This is the point assemblage from the site. This is spectacular here. This is clear crystal quartz, this Clovis point. You could see through it. You could see the ground when they found that. You could see the ground under it. These were found in place, and then, as I said, we have several dozen on the uplands. So these are the materials and some small flakes. So it's not a big feature, mainly because most of it's gone, taken away by erosion. We've got everything that's left. So the question we had for a long time is what were the bones? We even wondered if it was bison, but we finally found the jaw, the mandible. It was upside down. It was clearly an elephant of some kind. And, or I should say proboscidean, these aren't elephants. The mammoth and mastodon, I think, are elephants. But in the Americas, there was a third proboscidean, gomphothere. Gomphotheres are more common in South America and Central America. Mastodon and mammoth were common in North America and also onto the south. Well, as it turned out, and you could tell from the teeth, our animal, Fin del Mundo, was a gomphothere. It's the first and only Clovis gomphothere ever found. It's the northernmost late Pleistocene gomphothere documented. So you get the feeling you had this sort of southern edge of Clovis overlapping with the northern edge of gomphotheres, and they got to hunt a gomphothere, 2 of them, rather than mammoth and mastodon. So that was quite a remarkable surprise. Several surprises for us that we had this unusual animal and an unusual association of Clovis with this animal. So coming back to the question, were they big game hunters? I've already talked about some kills, and not just Clovis, but Clovis is where the issue comes up a lot, because the arrival of Clovis technology very roughly coincides with the extinction of roughly 45 genera of animals, all kinds of big animals, mammoth, mastodon, gomphotheres, some cats, the bison, camels, several varieties of camels and horse, bear, all sorts of big animals became extinct very roughly when Clovis arrived. Now, as it turns out, a lot of the extinction had already happened before Clovis times. But anyway, so this is another great debate. So one great debate that I talked about in my last lecture, were people around before Clovis? That's pretty well taken care of, but we still have this debate. Did Clovis people hunt these animals to extinction? That's an idea that's been around for a long time. Or was climate the culprit? Climate change, the environment was changing dramatically as we come out of the last ice age into the modern, warmer, drier times. Or some people have even argued it was a combination of both. Maybe the animals were under stress due to the climate changes, and hunting was just that extra bit of stress to push them over, literally over the brink, over the edge to extinction. Well, one way to look at the evidence, this is a summation of what we know about Clovis kill sites in all of North America. There are 12 mammoth sites. Clovis mammoth associations are about 12. A couple of sites, it's sort of depends on who you ask. There's one mastodon kill, one gomphothere kill I just told you about. There are a couple of bison kills, but bison survived the extinction. There are loads of later bison kills, Folsom bison kills, like Paleoindian bison kills. Just one, I think one, maybe two Clovis camel kills, and one, maybe two Clovis horse kills. And that is it. That is literally all the evidence we have for Clovis associated with big animals, with extinct animals. So were they big game hunters? To me, my view, Clovis certainly doesn't account for the extinction as far as I'm concerned, because there's so little association of the animals with artifacts. And then there's other evidence that's come to light from sites that aren't kill sites, showing that Clovis had a much broader diet. This is a bias that some people have talked about. I mean, you think about it. Okay, if you're out and wandering down an arroyo, what's going to catch your eye? Some flint flakes from a camp, or a mastodon tusk sticking out of the arroyo wall? Well, or a layer of bison bones sticking on an arroyo wall. Well, you're going to see the bones. So there is an argument, and there's something to it that for a long time there was a bias toward kill sites, and so we think that that's what these people did all the time. But we now know that the diet was almost certainly more diverse. But the debate still goes on about to what extent humans were involved in the demise of these animals. I personally don't think. Maybe mammoth, but even that, mammoth seemed to be on the way out. And I should mention that all of these animals became extinct except for bison in the Americas. And in the old world, mammoth became extinct at different times on different continents. So to me, that seems like there has to be more going on than people hunting them to extinction. Okay, well, to sum up, we find Clovis kills in near streams and wetlands, but most of the Paleoindian kills are near streams or wetlands, probably because that's where the animals were. We find, I should have added in here, the campsites tend to be on, that we know of, there are very few Clovis campsites, but they tend to be on older stable surfaces near these wetlands or near these streams. And of course, we find them where they are preserved and exposed. So there's that bias too. We don't know what we're missing. There are no known Clovis sites adjacent to big paleo lakes. At least that seems to be the case. There are a lot more Folsom sites around big paleo lakes, like on that early slide that showed the paleo lakes. Now, a caveat here is that there's very few Clovis artifacts, as I mentioned a while ago, west of the Great Plains. There are very few, relatively speaking, in the Southwest compared to Folsom. There are a lot more Folsom sites, at least in New Mexico. They're rare in southern Arizona, and I don't know of any in northern Sonora. We don't know a single Folsom point from northern Sonora. So there were more Folsom people around, using the landscape probably the same way as Clovis, but more of them on the landscape doing more different things. We just don't have as good a feel for of how Clovis people were using the landscapes, except at these few kill sites I just talked about in the Southwest, because we just don't have that many sites. And then climatically, I didn't even go into that. We're very clearly coming out of cooler, maybe drier conditions, shifting to warmer and drier conditions once you get into Folsom in later times. Okay, well, that is the end, Elfine. For me, I'm going to, what do I want to do? I'll come back to that. I'll stop sharing. If people want to look at the slides, we can do that. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I'd be happy to answer questions. I don't know if you all want to moderate, if somebody wants to moderate. I see it. I'll answer one question that popped up. What's the name of the woman that worked at Fin del Mundo? Her name is Guadalupe Sanchez, or Lupita, we called her. And she lives and works in Hermosillo, Sonora. I'm glad you asked that. She was my co-conspirator down there. Okay, I can't hear anybody right now. Can't hear.
Oh, I have a question.
I have a question I'd like to ask of you.
Let's see, Cole. Cole, I heard Cole speak up, so I'll answer Cole first. Yes.
Oh, thank you very much for giving this talk. I know you had mentioned that there aren't really Clovis sites around the big paleo lakes. That's more going into Folsom times. And I was wondering why you think that might be. That were they avoiding them altogether, or was it just not really like a place they found interesting?
I think it's because there's just so few Clovis to begin with. We just, like in the Tularosa Basin, I showed you the Mockingbird Gap site in Coronado de Muerto Basin. You go south into the Tularosa Basin where White Sands is.
Yes.
I have yet to see a single Clovis point from anywhere in the Tularosa Basin. They just weren't that many on the landscape. So that, I think that's part of it. There may be Clovis sites around these lakes, but they're just so few and far between, we're not seeing them. But Folsom just completely overwhelmed. Just in terms of numbers of sites or numbers of artifacts, Folsom just completely overwhelms Clovis. And you really get the feeling there just weren't that many on the landscape. And it's probably a visibility issue just because there's so few Clovis sites.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
What's the difference in the history, the years of history between Clovis and Folsom?
The time difference?
Yes.
They appear to overlap. There essentially is none.
But Clovis was first.
I'm sorry, Clovis was first. Yeah, I'd say 13,000 to 12,007, and Folsom's coming in at about that time, and goes on to about 12,000. It seems there's some evidence, people have discussed this for a while, that you pick up a few, as I said, there's a couple of Clovis bison kills. And so the thinking is now, and with some new dating, it looks like Clovis survives beyond the mammoth, and the mammoth are gone. And so they're switching over to hunting, starting to hunt bison. And some people have argued that Folsom points, smaller, evolved out of Clovis points to hunt bison, but that's conjecture. But there's a very close tie, at least in time, between Clovis and Folsom.
So one more question. And I'm not an archaeologist by any, I'm just an interested guy. What do you think the population was at that time? Somebody's made a guess.
Oh, lots of people have made guesses.
Well, I mean, give me a
To be
range. Are we
perfectly
talking-
honest, I haven't paid attention to that.
Okay.
It must be, well, it depends on where you are. You know, it's going to be for Clovis, considering particularly in the east, there are a lot of Clovis sites and Clovis points in the east. You know, you're talking tens of thousands. You have to be talking tens of thousands of people scattered across the continent. But I should know that because I get that question. To be honest, I really don't think about it. It's just not. I'm sorry, but it's a good question, but I can't answer it.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking. I'll go ahead, and I see a couple of questions coming in. Are there other Clovis sites in northern Mexico? Yeah, we spent some time looking. There are surface sites. There was one that was already known to the east of Fin del Mundo, and then there's surface sites. Nothing like the buried site. Nothing like El Fin del Mundo. That's another thing I should mention. It's the first Clovis site, and in fact, it's the first intact excavated Paleoindian site in northern Mexico. And so the Mexican archaeologists are really tickled about that. So there are Clovis artifacts scattered around. And then, yes, I see there is an article about Guadalupe's career. Yes, in the magazine Mammoth Trumpet, they often feature news stories about Paleoindian archaeologists. And the issue that just came out has a very nice article on Guadalupe Sanchez, and they talk about El Fin del Mundo. Let's see. Oh, I heard about indicating a series of caches. There's a really nice book on Clovis caches where people have found lots of Clovis points and other flaking material together. Now, interestingly, very few of them were actually excavated by professional archaeologists. Most of them were found by accident and dug up. But there are a number of these scattered around. They're really spectacular. Some of the raw material is just eye-popping. In fact, I know a place, I'll tell you, where you can see one on display is the museum on the campus of the University of Colorado. A guy working on his swimming pool in his backyard in Boulder found this cache. And fortunately, there was a Paleoindian archaeologist on the faculty. And so they got to see it in place, and they have a spectacular display at the University of Colorado Museum. Most of these caches are not on display or in public hands. Most are in private hands. But there's lots of ideas on why Clovis. You don't see many other caches. Some people think, particularly in the West, there were so few people on the landscape. It appears that they were just learning the landscape. And so if you don't know what's ahead of you, maybe you'll leave a cache of material behind that you could get back to in case you don't find more good raw material to make artifacts. That's one idea. You know, there could be some sort of social or religious connotations that we can't get at, but the caches are really interesting, and as I say, they're just beautiful. Are there other, in addition to Murray Springs, are there other black mats? Laner, which is south of Murray Springs, that's the type locality for black mats is the San Pedro Valley. It sort of depends on how you define a black mat. To me, it's a layer that's black, but some of the black mats are in fact white. My predecessor, Vance, very famous, highly respected Paleoindian archaeologist, he came up with this term black mat. And he says that black mats include lake beds composed of white sediment. So by that definition, we have a black mat at Fin del Mundo, maybe at the Clovis Site, and a few others. I mean, it depends on who you ask. Vance and I sort of agree to disagree on this. I think about black mats differently than he does, but there's a few other sites, not as many as you might think, that have these black mats. And you find black mats in all time periods. There's nothing special about black mats right after Clovis times. They're all over the place.
Dr. Holliday, when you were on these kill sites, did you see any concentration of points in any specific area of the body of an animal?
No. Oh, at Fin del Mundo or in general?
In general, whether it was in like the chest or the stomach or the neck, or, I mean, did they go after a certain area of the animal?
I'm trying to think. Most of the bone piles are disarticulated. The bones are taken apart and they do whatever they're going to do, take meat off, hide off. And so you don't necessarily know about the association. Were they butchering this good evidence that they used Clovis points as hafted knives? Were they, butchering and leave the artifact, or they couldn't find it because it was lost in the mess? So I don't know of anyone documenting what you're talking about. And I think the reason for that is because it seems to be relatively random. For example, at Fin del Mundo, several of the Clovis points there were in the space between the two kills, in the two bone piles. We don't know where exactly where they were killed. We assume it was where the bone piles are. But a couple of the points were in between, and the others were under the bone piles. So essentially, to answer your question, no, I don't know of any associations, and I think I would have heard about that because there's so many factors involved in where the point is going to end up relative to the bone. Now, there's some Clovis sites where they actually have impacts, the tip of the point in vertebra in one case I can think of. We don't have anything like that with Clovis. Okay, I see another question. Is there a black mat at that site Dr. Della Russo has been working on near Sonora? Yes, and I've worked on that site with Robert, but it's not Clovis. It's not post Clovis. It's much younger. It's like 10,000 years old as opposed to 13,000 years old. So it's a good example of it's a wetland. I mean, it's black because there's organic matter in it. And there's a wetland deposit, and these people are hanging around wetlands. And it's significantly younger than Clovis. And when we first started working there, we found one little remnant of black mat that turned out to be Clovis age. Now remember, in the San Pedro Valley, the stereotypical black mat is on top of Clovis, post Clovis. And there was a remnant of organic sediment that's Clovis age, a little bit older than Clovis. And then there was a big gap in time of a couple of thousand years, and then quite an extensive black mat at the site. Water Canyon is the name of the site.
So do you think, I'm a food guy? Okay, that's my specialty is preparing food and putting food, preserving food. Tuna specifically. Anyway, so I'm a long way from this. So you kill a mammoth that weighs, let's say, 2,000 pounds, and you quarter it out. Do you get 1,000 pounds of meat? And if you do, how many people are they feeding for how many days before it goes bad? Are they doing this in the wintertime? Or has anybody thought that one through?
There are all sorts of guesstimates. There's a site in Wyoming, Colby, and they found piles of mammoth in a paleo arroyo, piles of bones, and then the artifacts under each pile. And the argument was that the bone was their caches in a stream channel that carried cold water. This is Wyoming, and this is 13,000 years ago. stands to reason that the water coming out of the mountains is going to be pretty darn cold. Now, there's no way to know that, but that was an idea for, okay, maybe this is a cache and they would keep coming back to it. Yeah, this has been a debate for a long time, is okay, you kind of like the dog chasing the car. All right, we killed a mammoth. Now what do we do with it? You don't find that many points, but I mean, who knows what that means, how many points are left behind. There's certainly going to be a lot of meat. What they do with all of that is anybody's guess. You'd think it would require a lot of people just to haul this stuff away and make use of it. Even imagine the hide, how much a mammoth hide is going to weigh when it's fresh. We don't have the kind of data we need, but yeah, you're going to get a lot of meat out of it. But what they did with it, it's anybody's guess, because we don't have the right kind of evidence, because of course the meat isn't preserved. All we have is a pile of bones, and then we have the artifacts.
Yeah, in the winter you freeze, and in the summer you dry. I mean, that's the kind of thing that's the kind of thing you're doing. And in the Southwest, in the summertime, you're going to get a winter. It's just occurred to me that I asked the question. So yeah.
Keep in mind though, the Southwest in the summertime, 13,000 years ago, very different place than the Southwest today in the summer.
Okay.
But it's dry. It's still dry.
Yeah.
Not necessarily hot, but still dry. Let me see.
Dr. Holliday, from the points that you saw and found, how far away did the farthest source on these lithics come from? There's an argument that all of these people, Clovis, Folsom, and the other Paleoindians, were pretty mobile. And one of the reasons they say that is because a lot of the artifacts come from long distance. And the argument for Clovis too is that they were mobile because it just was nobody else around. And I'm trying to think, some of the Fin del Mundo material seems to be out of gravel, chert gravel. And some of that is reasonably close by. We don't have a quarry, but we've seen gravel in some of the arroyos and streams that look similar. Now, there is crystalline quartz about 10 kilometers away. There's a hill, El Cerro Corzo, that's just loaded with in-place clear crystalline quartz. And that's almost certainly where that Clovis point I showed you came from. And we have several other crystalline Clovis artifacts at Fin del Mundo. There's some at one, I think Lehner had 3 clear crystal Clovis artifacts. And they may well have come from the same place, but that would have been a couple of 100 kilometers. Certainly, some of the artifacts are pretty local, say kilometers or tens of kilometers, but there are a few cases when they're probably the raw material is probably coming from on the order of 100 kilometers or more. Like in the San Pedro Valley, some of the cherts are probably coming from maybe northern Arizona as opposed to southern Arizona. And also, I remember when I was a kid, I used to read about something called a Sandia Point, which was supposed to be older than Clovis. Is that still a thing, Sandia?
No, it was probably a hoax.
Okay.
That's a long story, but let me take it back. One of the ideas on the Sandia Point at Sandia Cave outside of Albuquerque, or the type locality, one idea that's been floated is that the points were used to quarry ochre. There's ochre in Sandia Cave, that they're not older than Clovis. They're just a different kind of tool for mining. Who knows? But there's it's a tainted story, because it's almost certain that the next Sandia site, the only other in place Sandia site, the Lucy site, was probably faked. So Sandia is sort of off to the, unfortunately. Cole has a question. Maybe mammoths were killed during gatherings, religious, cultural gatherings of multiple Paleoindian groups as a way to provide for feast rituals. Yeah, that's certainly a possibility that you'd think it has to be a relatively large group effort. You wouldn't necessarily need that many people to kill them, I don't think. But if you're going to use all that food, you got to have people around. Now, there is also the idea that some of these sites are scavengers, that the animals were not hunted and killed, that they were found freshly dead, and that the points were used as knives, not as ballistic weapons. That's that's raised a lot of hackles. But it's certainly possible at least some of these sites are scavenger. Maybe an animal was very sick or dying or wounded somehow, and then they finished them off. So then that's just an opportunistic thing.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
On the skulls, did you see evidence where the skulls were actually forced open, maybe by humans, to get at the brain?
Not that I know of. I've only worked on a couple of these sites. No, that's a really good question, because you see that on some of the later sites, but not. I'm trying to think. There's certainly intact skulls for some of these sites. I can think of a couple where the skulls. Well, at the Clovis Site, the one I was talking about in Wyoming, where you have caches. One of the really interesting things about those caches is that there's a skull on top of each one. Now think about that, hefting a mammoth skull, fresh mammoth skull with tusk intact. That's a lot of work. But anyway, now that as I think about it, most of them are intact, unless they're weathered, breakage from weathering. But I don't think there's any evidence of anybody busting them open. On the other hand, maybe they're on a skull that's so big, there are other ways of getting inside, getting at the brain. It's a good question. That's a good zooarchaeology question. Anybody else? I'm happy to answer questions as long as people have questions. Trying to think if
Are there any questions in the chat room?
Yeah, that's what I was reading. I hadn't heard that theory. How many processing tools have been found in these assemblages? We certainly don't have many at Fin del Mundo, but that's because most of the site is missing. There are a couple, literally 2 or 3. That's a good question. I don't think of that many tools like the Murray Springs assemblage, the whole assemblage for the mammoth kill at Murray Springs, and for the bison kill for that matter. The whole tool assemblage, points and other tools, it's no more than maybe not even a dozen artifacts. And at the Clovis site, yeah, that's a good question. Not as many as you might think, because they may have taken them. Some of the later kills, some of the Folsom and later kills, there's a lot of tools that are left behind. There's a couple of sites right on the border, Texas-New Mexico border, east of Clovis. One of them, it was a Plainview, like Paleoindian, 130 Plainview points left in a bison bone bed. And then 500 meters away, the Milne Sand type site, same age, 85 Milne Sand points, beautiful points, Plainview's beautiful points left in the bone bed. And there's got to be a reason why they're leaving that many points in 2 different kills, 500 meters apart. So there's more going on in terms of what they leave and what they take than we probably realize. And maybe it changes through time.
Are the sites that you talked about tonight, are they protected from looters and pot hunters and collectors?
Let me think about that. Folsom is owned by the state and surrounded by a huge ranch. The Clovis site is owned by Eastern New Mexico University, but of course, most of Clovis went away with quarrying, but what's left is protected. Mockingbird Gap is on BLM land, was heavily collected. Fin del Mundo is so remote. it's protected by its sheer remoteness, and we've been pretty careful about who we talk to and what we tell them about Fin del Mundo, and it's hard to get to. Let me think. And the San Pedro Valley sites, they're Murray Springs and Laner are part of the BLM has a riparian preserve along the San Pedro Valley. And they purposely incorporated the Laner site and Murray Springs into that preserve. In fact, Murray Springs, you can go to and do a walking tour. They have some signs, and it's just east of Sierra Vista, Arizona. And you can drive there. It's a nice parking lot, and you can walk through it. So yeah, so of the ones I mentioned, most of them are protected in one way or another. Yeah. Fortunately.
Are there any other questions?
Is there evidence?
One more in the chat.
Is there evidence of bone breakage from marrow? I know that some of the Clovis Mammoth sites, I'm drawing a blank on which ones. I know there are a couple of the Mammoth kills where the bones, the long bones are broken presumably for marrow. I know I'm more familiar with the bison kills. That's really common with the bison kills. And bison is clearly the choice, though. There's so many Folsom bison kills in later ones. There's no doubt those people are specialists in hunting bison. The question is Clovis, were they specialists in hunting these big animals? But I know there are a couple where they broke the bones open. Okay, well, thanks everybody. It's good to see you all again.
This is so fascinating. So fascinating, Dr. Holliday. Thank you so much.
Sure thing. Yeah, I'm sure I'll see you all again.
Don't
Good.
Careful what you ask for. Well, tonight I want to present you again with this certificate for tonight, and I'll be sending that to you. I appreciate it. And a very fine talk. Very good. Thank you very much. Let me tell everybody about next month, which is going to be March 9th. We're going to have Professor Ed Nell. I think he's Cal State Fullerton, if I remember correctly. The title of his talk is Paleoindian Land Use at Pluvial Lake Mojave in California's Mojave Desert. So I hope everybody can join us then with Ed. And if nobody else has any questions or announcements, I will bid goodnight to everybody and thank you for joining us tonight.
Joe, I just wanted to say thank you for getting all these speakers that you get. You've done such a wonderful job for us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Here.
I look at television. Sometimes I look at YouTube. I don't read papers anymore. And when I see somebody, I call them up. And some people have asked me, how did you get so-and-so to talk? I said, I called him. He answered the phone. Yeah. So that's all you have to do is just contact them. But anyway,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you, everybody, and good night. We'll see you next month, hopefully.
Great job. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Good night to everyone. Look forward to seeing you all next month.